Hello, friends. Welcome to this discussion on the war in Ukraine and its implications for India. I am Abhay Vaidya, Director, Pune International Center. A number of very senior members of the Pune International Center have been career diplomats and military commanders and have been watching the developments in Ukraine very closely. We are fortunate to have them with us today to discuss what this tragic conflict means to Ukraine, to Russia, to Europe, to the US, to the world, and of course to India. Chairing today's discussion is PIC's trustee, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, India's former ambassador to China, Pakistan, and Bhutan. He is also co-author of PIC's book, Rising to the China Challenge, Winning Through Strategic Patience and Economic Growth. We have on our panel Ambassador Sudhir Devre, who was the first Indian ambassador to Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia, and opened the Indian embassies in these newly formed countries in 1992. Our other panelists include the former Vice Chief of Air Staff, Air Marshal Bhushan Gokhale, and the former GOC in C of 15 Corps in the Kashmir Valley, Lieutenant General Vinayak Patankar. Among our discussants is someone with business operations in the former Soviet Union, Mr. Yogesh Joshi, Director, Representative Office of Serum Institute of India in Moscow. A warm welcome to all of you. This discussion has a Q&A segment, and you are welcome to post your questions in the question box. For the benefit of those who are new to Pune International Center, I would like to mention that this is a think tank which works in the areas of national security, energy, environment and climate change, social innovation, science, technology, innovation and growth, and economic reforms and urbanization. We regularly hold discussions on current affairs, new books, and conversations with domain experts. Our most recent conference a fortnight ago was the Asia Economic Dialogue, an international geoeconomics conference in association with the Ministry of External Affairs. With this brief introduction, I welcome you once again to this discussion. May I now request the chair for today's event, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, to initiate the proceedings. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abhay. And as all of you know, that the topic that we are going to be discussing today is the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Where is it heading and the implications for India? Now, I must say at the very start that I'm only chairing this session. So as a common Punekar and a common Indian, I'm going to be raising a lot of questions, which I want the four specialists on this panel, Ambassador Devre, General Patankar, Air Marshal Gokhale, and Mr. Yogesh Joshi to answer. You know, most Indians keep asking the question, why has Russia invaded Ukraine? This is the narrative which is being put out by the West. The Russians themselves say that they are conducting special military operations in Ukraine. So what I would like to do is I'd like to kick off by asking Ambassador Devre, who's been India's first ever ambassador to Ukraine when it became an independent entity, an independent country, to just walk us through some of the history which has led to the current crisis. So let me quickly give the floor and yield the floor to Ambassador Devre.
Thank you, Ambassador Bambawale. First, let me thank PIC for inviting me to this program this evening on a topic which is really engaging the attention of the whole world. In fact, today I think is the 14th day of the Russia-Ukraine war. And we, as all of us know, these days wars don't last for so long. And this is really very unusual that it has been going on. Well, there have been massive loss of life to property. Ukraine is being under threat and under constant bombing and shelling. And the kind of damage Ukraine has seen since I have lived in Kiev and Ukraine, I can imagine myself how horrible the whole scenario is now at the moment. In fact, one can say that after the Second World War, this is the biggest tragedy that Ukraine, that any country in Europe, perhaps I think Bosnia and Herzegovina in between, barring that, Ukraine is faced with. In fact, Ukraine today is faced with two major, very serious things. One is the humanitarian crisis following this 14 days war, in which a lot of women, children, innocent lives have been lost, and there are millions of refugees from Ukraine going elsewhere in Europe. And the second, and the bigger threat is at the moment, is in fact the very existence of Ukraine, because the way war is going on, the relentless bombing and airstrikes of Russia against Ukraine brings this very grim scenario whether Ukraine itself will survive. And I think this is a kind of situation which augurs very, very badly for the whole world. Well, the question which you asked, Gautam, why Russia invaded Ukraine? Russians are calling it special forces operation. The whole world is calling invasion, given the fact that there was massive Russian preparation for the war. Nearly 2 lakh army of Russia was all around the Ukrainian border with most modern military equipment. Hello, sorry. Yeah. Now, Russia and Ukraine, very briefly, they are like conjoined twins, both separated and now completely irrevocably separated, very similar in many ways. But at the same time, Ukraine has its own identity. In fact, as you may have read somewhere, Ukraine is the mother of Russia. Kievan Rus, which goes back to 12th century, was where Russian religion, the Orthodox religion started. There was a kingdom there from where the influence of Russian and the Russian culture spread. Although Ukraine has been under domination of Russia or other powers in Europe, even from the Eastern European side, it had maintained its identity. It has different religion, and it is Catholic religion in the west part of Ukraine. Ethnically also, the influence of Hungarian, Lithuanian, Polish, even Tatar, these influences mark a little different identity to Ukraine than that to Russia. Russia has primarily Russian, also Asian identity. And again, after the end of the Cold War, so Ukraine was recognized as a separate country. There have been several agreements. So last 30 years, it is an independent country. Even in the time of when the United Nations was formed, Ukraine was given a status of an independent country, and it had a seat as the founder of the United Nations. Now, how this whole situation has come to this kind of level can be very briefly, I can mention that. Actually, Ukraine showed considerable pro-EU and West inclination right from the time of its independence. And it got accentuated after President Putin came to power in 2000. In 2008, Ukraine had applied for NATO membership. And though UK and US were very keen on granting that, it is at the instance of France and Germany, it was withheld, although the application was not asked to be withdrawn. In 2013 and 14, when Russia had offered an economic union with Russia to Ukraine, the Ukrainians chose to have a similar union with the European Union. And on this issue, there were massive demonstrations which led to nearly 80-90 people being killed in the heart of Kiev. So in fact, the whole problem, what we see today, goes back to that period when the intense hatred and distrust for each other started really getting manifest. And soon after that, President Putin then had this referendum in Crimea, and Crimea was annexed. The resistance in Donbass, that is Lugansk and Donetsk, by the Russian-speaking people with the help of Russia started, and the situation has continued to aggravate. In October, November last year, when the Russians started moving their armed forces on the border of Ukraine, that was the time, in my view, I think there was a scope for diplomacy. And in fact, what we see today in this war is a clear failure of diplomacy between the Russians on one side, Ukrainians on the other side, and the West in the larger sense. Because this whole issue is not just between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is actually kind of a small player in this, is a pawn in this big game. And this diplomatic solution could have been possible for two reasons. One, Ukraine was, as I said, was not granted NATO membership despite its application from 2008. The 14 years had passed. NATO Council was not unanimously approving membership for Ukraine. Similarly, when the German Chancellor went to Moscow a few days before the war started on 24th February, he had openly declared that membership of Ukraine was not on the NATO agenda. And Americans had made very clear to President Zelensky and the world that their troops will not be on the soil of Ukraine to fight for Ukraine. So it was very clear that Ukraine will have to fight against Russia on their own. Of course, at that stage, no one thought that Russians will really march into Ukraine with their army and with their air power. So, in fact, nobody was taking this kind of thing seriously. We were in close touch ourselves because I have still a few friends in Kiev, and I used to talk to them on phone, and they would tell me that, look, things are not so bad. We are not leaving Kiev. We don't expect the Russians to attack us. Now, the diplomacy part, which I'm talking about, is at that stage, if President Zelensky of Ukraine had somehow declared that he will not be interested in the NATO membership because it was not coming in any case to Ukraine, and the question of neutrality of Ukraine on the lines of neutrality of Austria or Finland or Sweden or Cyprus could have been negotiated by the West along by putting some pressure on Zelensky. Perhaps, I'm not sure, but perhaps this could have been achieved. On the part of Russia, I think invasion of Ukraine, which Putin and Russians call it a special forces operation, perhaps really did not serve their purpose. Because if the Russians were asking for security guarantees before the war started on 24, 3-4 guarantees they were asking, and the West was not prepared to give these guarantees in writing. Number one was NATO membership. Secondly, no interference in the NATO countries against from there to against Russia, or by putting high weaponry in Ukraine and so on. But that was not possible. Now, by launching this kind of war, has Russia's security been enhanced? In what way Russia's strategic interests are really served? That could be one question. Russian credibility is seriously nowadays is hampered because of this kind of action, though it can be claimed by Russians that in their permanent interests, they wanted kind of a situation where there will be no threat from Ukraine in the future. But to have a neighbor like Ukraine, and mind you, Ukraine is not a small country, fairly large country with about 45 million people, an area as big as France, it can pose for Russia in the future serious problems. There can be resistance movement there, guerrilla warfare from there. And Russia has the experience of Afghanistan 30, 40 years ago. When you attack or when you go into a territory which has very alien kind of population, what happens? So I don't know whether Russian security has also been enhanced. So I think we are in a situation where everybody seems to have lost. The Russians also, Ukrainians, of course, are getting very totally devastated. And I would say even the West. The Americans, who have been only talking about sanctions and severe sanctions, could not send boots to Ukraine or to NATO countries here nearby. And therefore, whether the American power, the American predominance today is on decline, that becomes really a question. European Union has been just watching this silently, have not been able to really do anything. And the world itself, in the United Nations also, has been just passing resolutions. They couldn't do anything. So I'll come to that later, Gautam. I thought I will, in little long, brief this background, but I thought I'll just give you the scenario.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Devre. Let me also say that, what we had intended that was that this can be a conversation between the four of you. But let me ask my next question to General Patankar and then also to Air Marshal Gokhale. Very key part of it is the military operations part. There's a lot of disinformation from both sides, which is being put out. Ordinary people on the street, we read a lot which is coming out from the West, a little bit of what is coming out from Russia. But let me ask you, General Patankar, and then move to Air Marshal Gokhale, about what is the actual military situation on the ground to the best of your knowledge. And also let me end by asking a question which is already in the chat box by Mr. Arun Firodia. He says that India won Bangladesh war in 13 days. Why has Russia been unable to do so? It's been 14 days, as Ambassador Devre has pointed out. So let me turn to you on the military aspects of this special operation, as the Russians call it.
Thank you, Gautam. I'll try and cover those aspects which you asked me to cover. But let me begin with a disclaimer, if you will, and that is all my analysis of what's going on is based on the open source information, which, as we all know, is mostly, I would say, essentially all Western media oriented. And that's one part. So the other thing is that my own reading, or where I try and read between the lines, to get more sense into it, I've been listening to the strategic thinkers and analysts based in our own country, because their own thinking and what they say is unbiased and not so colored as the Western media would have you believe. That's the second part. So let me begin by saying we firstly do not know what the political objective of Putin is. We are only at best making an estimate of this is probably what the Russians want or Putin wants. Because a military strategy and the complete military operations are based on the political objectives that has been laid out by the political leadership. So that's where it all starts. Now, since we do not know in real terms as to what the political objective is, and we would seldom know in any war at the beginning or at the front end of it, one can only make an estimate. And here's my estimate. You see, judging from the three demands that Putin has made very clear, I think that's an indicator to what their political objective might be. The first thing he has said is Ukraine will not join NATO. That's the first one. If they agree to that, well, that's well and good. Second one, a sort of an independence or some degree of autonomy to Eastern Ukraine, mainly the Donbas region, right? And the third one, which a recognition of Russian annexation of Crimea. These three conditions he has laid down. So that gives you an insight into what their political objective behind all this may well be. Of course, then there are other motivations. For instance, what Ambassador Deve was mentioning, that this business of membership of NATO, not only of Ukraine, but of other East European nations, has been a work in progress for the last 20 years or more. And all of us, I'm saying, since the videos of various people are going viral, the most popular being John Meschmeyer. So the thing that they've been saying is, what would USA's reaction be if Russian missiles were placed in Canada and Mexico? I mean, if you push a guy really that hard, what do you expect him to do? Particularly if you were a superpower once and have still not forgotten your where you want to go back to that, when and where you want to go back to. So the point is, those were triggers. Those were things where enough is enough kind of a situation was created. Second part is, once the political objective becomes clear, the next thing that comes at the highest level is the concept of operations. How are you going to do this? Take your mind back to the Iraq War. The concept was shock and awe. That became, it's a very catchy kind of a tagline. I wouldn't call it a slogan, but it was like a shock and awe became the byword, so to say, when the whole world was glued to the TV and seeing how the Allied offensive is going into Iraq. So was that the concept of operations? Knowing the Russians, it is unlikely that that's what they wanted to do, because when you say what would be Russia's likely concept of operations, you've got to go back into history and see how they do it. There are various other ways. Somebody mentioned about, the one question in the question box already is that where we took 13 days to finish the Bangladesh operations, how come 14 days are gone and you're still nowhere near this thing? How do we know we are nowhere near? Number one, because now if you see the progress of operations and the way they have been conducted, is this are all the Russian actions aimed at degradation of the Ukrainian military capability or annihilation of that capability? It doesn't seem that to be the latter. It is actually causing as much damage to the military machine to reduce their capability of fighting. Secondly, look at the way the prongs, the various advances have taken place. If you have the map, I might be able to, explain to you a little better. If you look at the map, the Russians have come in from three sides. From the north towards Kiev, from the east, they have gone and encircled Kharkiv, and of course they have gone through Donbas, and from the south, they have tried to isolate and almost make Ukraine a landlocked country. So these are three major prongs. Now, if you see the further progress of the Russians from Kharkiv, they are now moving in the direction, appear to be moving in the direction of Dnipro, which is more or less in the center, right along the river, right? In the center of the offensive, the area where the offensive is in eastern part of Ukraine. And if that links up with the offensive coming from the south, then you can see that the entire eastern part of the Dnieper River would be under Russian control. Now, that actually, if you see the the way the Ukrainian economy is, the eastern portion is the one that is more productive. That is the one that where the economic assets are substantially more than those in the west. So that is one part. Also, you now see the way they have encircled various cities. And mind you, a lot of people say, oh, just by encircling, you're not going to. Nobody, and I mean nobody, would like to get into a built-up area operation by entering a city. In a normal operation, an offensive operation, if you're looking for a superiority of, say, 1:3 or 1:4, it is at least 3 times more when you enter a built-up area. So no right-thinking military commander would like to get into street-by-street fighting. And what does he achieve at the end of it? How does he manage whatever has been captured? So the idea would be to bring the major centers, the urban centers, to their knees by actually starving them of resources, right? I mean, you just, of course, thankfully, Delhi was never starved of its resources, even during the 1 year plus gherao by the farmers. But that threat existed. Now, you'll understand that any major metropolis or a city is dependent heavily on inputs coming from the surrounding area. Now, that is the second part. Also, these cities also represent major communication hubs where the decision-making authorities remain, and command control centers. These are as you come into the field, then from cities, you look at things like key installations, logistics hubs, command and control centers, and so on and so forth. So in my own mind, I'm not convinced that the Russians are floundering. I think they're going as per plan. Somebody spoke of some 40, 50, 60 kilometers long convoy, and it's just lying, sitting duck for anyone to attack. Then if that be so, why hasn't the Ukrainian Air Force taken advantage of it and really caused heavy casualties? Because they're just simply not able to. That's the truth. Or for whatever reason, they're not able to, or they've chosen not to. As far as the air operations are concerned, I'll leave it to Bingo to talk about it. But suffice me to say that they are using just enough force to. Also, you see the kind of targets they have chosen. They, by and large, communication centers and not so much civil population. The other part is very cleverly handled by the Russians, as I see it, is when you attack a major population center, there is a huge outflow of refugees. Now, if you just don't control that and you allow people to go helter-skelter, they are going to be a nuisance to an advancing military force. So the best way is to give them an access and say, use that access to get out of that place. That way, the attacker is not confronting large human waves after waves who are blocking all the routes of communication, roads and roads, rail, and if there is any riverine area, any kind of waterways that are being used. So all in all, I think it's going as per plan. Perhaps, yes, they probably wanted to do it over 10 days and it's taken 14 days. I'm just guessing, or I'm just placing some numbers here. But the fact of the matter is, in every war, the first casualty is the plan itself. Whatever plans you make, you make plan A, plan B, plan C, and finally fight the plan D. That is something that every military commander will tell you. Anyone who's been in any kind of hostilities will tell you the first casualty is always the plan. So you plan for a thing, but you take it and you modify it as you go along. I think the Russians are doing precisely that at the moment.
Thank you.
They have isolated, they have bypassed, like Sumi. They have bypassed Sumi. They are not getting involved with Sumi. So I'll stop there as the initial burst,
thank you.
and
Thank
then
you.
take on later on.
Yeah, thank you. We have very limited time, so I would request that we need to be a little more pointed and to the point. Air Marshal Gokhale, let me just ask you, do you feel that the Russians are close to achieving the military objectives which they may have had at the start of this whole special military operations?
Thank you, Gautam. But I will go along with what General Parvika very rightly said. I think there is a plan that they're going by, but let me just add that this Mahabharat of Europe, I call it purposely Mahabharat because they're first cousins who have gone into war. Today is the 14th day, and I hope by the 18th day, the ceasefire takes place, if not today. But, this is a typical hybrid war in which, apart from the military, they've tried cyber. However, compared to Georgia, when they took over 2 districts, the Azakia and that happened. But not, this time, cyber war has not taken place to that effect. Both sides are very well prepared. There has been economic war, which has been just unleashed. Of course, we'll talk about it, whether it affects and things like that. There is other dimension before I come to military is the nuclear in space. They have attacked the nuclear plants. And because of the fear that the intelligence reports talked about, that since they had rescinded their own nuclear weapons in '92, Ukraine may be going in for assembling of another 8 or 10 weapons, which can be a real threat to Russia or to anybody for that matter. Many countries are now today talking about having their own nuclear option as a deterrence. And in that, there is a talk about dirty war, dirty bomb. There is a talk about US having helped out in having some sort of a bio labs. So this brings me to the information warfare. There has been all the time what we are talking is the Western narrative. Initial days of the war, I used to tune on to Russia TV on the 644, that is on the Tata channel. But now it has all been banned, even in India. So India also, most of the narrative is Western narrative. There is this Colonel Pawar, Rajesh Pawar, who's a SF officer actually, but he's giving very good coverage on the India Today TV. And he's put out a video to say as to how information warfare is working and that all this damage that has been shown, it is actually not there. He's also shown that, this building which have been damaged, he said they were taking shelters, these soldiers from the Ukraine, and that is how they finally had to be attacked. So as regards the military operations, very rightly, I think they are going by a particular plan which is not really stalled, but unlike what Mr. Farodia is asking, you see, the population in Bangladesh was with India. It is not the case in case of Ukraine. They are talking about civilians also who are taking up arms. And there are mercenaries. This morning, there was a news that some of the British troops have left and have joined as mercenaries. There are also talks that maybe the Polish and Czech and all these soldiers have joined. And the West is giving them real-time intelligence. So that is where the nuclear and the space aspect is also coming. And let me tell you about the nuclear. I used to go for conferences in Washington or in London for strategic weapons. And the Russians all the time talked about tactical nuclear weapons. And those days, Pakistan used to be brandishing tactical nuclear weapons. So I was, sort of concerned, like all of us. And I asked him, I said, what is your logic? He said, when US talks about an umbrella for all these European countries, suppose we use a tactical nuclear weapon against, say, Germany or maybe Poland or anybody, you think USA is going to start using ICBMs against us? No way. And that is why today you find South Korea, Japan, and everybody is now in the race for having their own nuclear weapons. So I think the Russians have got pretty good intelligence. I think they have a lot of intelligence gathering in Ukraine in particular, and of course all over. So they were worried. And there is this neo-Nazi. There is an Azov battalion, which is called, actually speaking, named after the Sea of Azov. They are neo-Nazis, white supremacy. I think some of our students in the Operation Ganga, which we rescued, something like 20,000 students in 70 flights. I think it was a great thing the Indians did. in that also they found that there is a lot of color discrimination that they suffered. The Nigerians suffered, and many others suffered. So there is this many inputs which I think went to President Putin. And one other important thing that happened was after 2014 Crimea annexation, Donbass in particular was getting hammered by the Ukrainian troops. The figures talk about something like 18,000 civilian casualties. And Russian TV initially was showing the damage to the civilian population and the civilian buildings in those areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. That is now not there. And all the time we are listening to or we are seeing pictures which at times are doctored pictures, or maybe they are from wherever it is. So with the result, I think that information warfare is playing a very, very important role. I will stop at that. But when it comes to effect on India in particular, because you see, we had, I never knew while we were, talking to Soviet Union then, that so many factories actually were in Ukraine. And later only that we started looking at Antonov Bureau and, getting N-32 and various other things. And so both sides have, actually speaking, a lot of possibilities of spare support, logistics. So we kept good relations with both. It's only later when Soviet Union broke up that we found Ukraine getting closer to Pakistan as compared to us and having voted against us, etc., etc. So I'll stop at that and wait for your next question.
Yeah, sure. Let me turn to Yogesh Joshi because he's normally based in Moscow. He's in Pune right now. He came back a little before this war started, and he's now staying on in Pune till at least some closure comes. Yogesh, I want to ask you two questions. One is, you must be paying much more attention to what the Russians are saying. You and I have discussed the long speech that President Putin made. I think it was on the 21st of February before he started the operations. And it is a speech which I must say is available in English. It's available on Google. I would urge all our viewers, listeners to read that speech. It's a rewriting of history, of course. But I'd like to ask you, Yogesh, two things. One is, can you make out what are the political objectives, as General Patankar was asking, of Putin in this war? Two, are we coming close to his achieving those objectives? And I also want you to talk a little about the sanctions which have been levied on Russia by the West. There's a whole plethora of sanctions. What are those sanctions? How they impact the Russian economy? If you can talk on all these subjects. Yogesh, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you, PIC, for this opportunity. Yes, although I'm not a political or a geopolitical expert, but since I have been with these people for almost 20 years now, so I have a very close relationship not only with the Russians but also with the Ukrainians, and I have been seeing the kind of perception they have of each other. That is very important, like how we have perceptions within our country of different states. Similarly, even in Russia, there are perceptions about people living in Kazakhstan or in Belarus or Ukraine and so on. So basically, coming to your first question on the speech of President Putin, my assessment based on what I have been discussing with people and what I have been reading through is there is a mistrust between the West and the Russian side right from the breakup of the USSR. And this mistrust on every point has only escalated, and it has never come down to a level where people can trust with each other. And this starts right from the time when the USSR broke up and Russia made a request to be a part of NATO. And that request was because they were thinking that we would be a part of Europe and the entire Europe together along with the Russia. And this is an opportunity for us that whatever technological investments and things like that we could gain from the West, it would help us to further fortify, because although they were strong in certain areas, on a large part of areas in the USSR, they were actually missing out because of the funds and because of their unidirectional approach towards space program and arms and armaments. But that never happened, unfortunately. And then, as we have already discussed, Once again, it happened in 2008 when the Bucharest conference happened, and once again, Ukraine and Georgia were given an open invitation to join NATO. In 2008, there was an attack on Georgia. Then there was a thaw till 2014. Nothing really came out. Again, annexation of Crimea. Then again, there was a thaw. Nothing came out of it. And every time Putin insisted that, especially after 2014, that why don't we implement the Minsk agreement? Because that was something which was brokered with France, Germany, US, Russia, all together. And although on the discussion table, they have always maintained that, yes, it needs to be implemented and it has to be all these 3 points which General Patankar mentioned, that recognition of Donbass and Crimea as a part of Russia and so on. But in real sense, it never happened, and it is said that Ukraine themselves and their neighboring countries like Poland, Hungary, the erstwhile communist bloc, they had reservations about this particular thing, because they always maintained that if we are a sovereign nation, we should be allowed to choose whether we want to join EU or whether we join NATO and so on. The distinction that Russia makes is that EU is an economic forum, whereas NATO is a military forum. So if there is a guarantee given to these countries that US, EU, and Russia would take care of your security needs, then why is the need for all these bordering nations to join NATO and get military installations of US done very much in the backyard of Russia, which they have always objected? So in the speech, precisely, he mentioned that as one point of concern. Second point of concern was that, as Ambassador Devre rightly mentioned, that Kievan Rus is the beginning or the start point when the Orthodox Christianity moved from Constantinople first on to Kiev, and then it got split, and part of it is in Sofia now, and part of it is in Kiev as the major hub of Orthodox Christianity. And from there on, it spread towards the east, and then the Russia is a part of Orthodox Christianity. So that is what he mentioned, that this is my interpretation, of course, that when Putin mentioned that Ukraine does not have an independent existence, that is what was inferred from his speech. He actually meant was that whatever was spread from Kievan Rus to Russia, so it came to Russia and everybody was part of it. But this mixture of population that was there on the western part of Kiev, which, as you rightly pointed out earlier, that it was a mix of the Lithuanian or the Swedish or the Polish principalities. So they had a very different view, and that conflict always existed between the Russians by and large and the Ukrainian population. And this, I think, was his major points. And he, in fact, if you must have noted that when he took the decision of marching into Ukraine, he took a press conference, called up the mayors of Donetsk and Luhansk, and asked them on an open line, what do you want? And they said that we want freedom from the Ukrainian, and let there be a federal structure, and let us have our own autonomy, and we can be part of the federal structure and things like that. And therefore, we need your military assistance, because otherwise we would not be able to fight if there is a Ukrainian army onslaught on us. And using that as the base, he probably went into with the army first into the eastern part in Donbass, and then further to the military part, of course, has been in detail discussed. So I think this forms the basis. There is a mistrust. Earlier there was a mistrust between the West and Russia, and now that mistrust has further added a deep wedge between the two Slavic nations of Russia and Ukraine itself. And further within Ukraine, it has created a wedge between the Western Ukraine and the Eastern Ukraine. And one of the trigger points which probably the Ukrainians could have thought of is this passing the resolution of a single language across the country. Because if you see, the east of Dnieper is predominantly Russian. The west of Dnieper also is not predominantly Ukrainian. It is primarily the Lvov, Lutsk, or Vinnytsia and those parts which are predominantly Ukrainian-speaking population. So I can narrate one example to you. I was there in one of the Decembers 2-3 years ago, and when I was leaving, 2014 in fact, when this happened. When I was leaving Ukraine to come back to India, the security guard at the airport asked me, "How many languages do you have? Are you from India?" First he asked. I said, "Yes, I'm from India." "Are you going back to your homeland for the New Year?" I said, "Yes, I'm going back to my homeland for the New Year." He said, "How many languages do you have in India?" I said, "We have 22 official languages." He said, "See, you have 22 official languages and you are all staying together without a problem. And we have just 2, and yet we have a problem at our end." So this resistance to be able to accommodate populations of different languages or different religious backgrounds is by and large, my observation is by and large a problem of entire Europe. And that is the reason they have small countries with a population of 1 million, 3 million, 2 million, and yet they are independent countries because they are not able to get along with their neighbors, probably.
You have 3 or 4 minutes to talk about the sanctions. We need to turn to the questions. There are lots of questions in the chat box. And I'd like to ask everyone, we're really running out of time.
Yes. So I'm coming to the sanctions now. Now, there is a big list of sanctions. I would just focus on the major ones. Shall we have the slides put up? I will just glide through it, because with figures around, it will be a bit difficult to just explain verbally.
Sure.
So the main sanctions is that basically with the US and EU and UK freezing the assets of the Russian banks, and that to the Central Bank of Russia, it is basically an indicator that Russia cannot do business with anybody now. So the USD is blocked, the euro is blocked, and the pound is blocked. So only possibility is if they work out a Russia ruble, like in case of India, or a yuan to a ruble, which they're already doing with the China. So is the presentation shared, or should I share?
Sir, you could share. You could go ahead.
Yeah, okay, I'll share. Okay, thank you so much. So this is basically the list of sanctions. The banking sector is under sanction. All military, technology, defense, etc. is under sanction. Then the SWIFT system. Now, this is yet to be implemented fully, but I think the US has already taken more steps towards the implementation. Then all this news channels, Russia Today and Sputnik, they have been banned, and there is a ban for various kind of business activities, including tourism, in the Donbas region as well. Now, how does the banking sector restrictions or sanctions affect Russia, or how are they supposed to affect? So what Russia has smartly done, probably they knew that they are going to be facing a lot of sanctions, and therefore they have kept their forex reserves split into various different ways. So in gold, there is 22% almost. And then you can find that in US dollar, there is 16%, euro 32%, yuan is 13%, and others, which are commodities. And I understand even 5% of their forex is in Indian rupees, because since 2014, all our trade with the Indian government has been in rupee and ruble. So this would give some respite to Russia, probably, to salvage their foreign reserves. Otherwise, their USD and euro reserves are definitely blocked. Now, when you have sanctions on Russia, basically it is a two-edged sword. So while you are trying to isolate Russia and hamper their economy, if you are having a big trade with Russia, that it is also going to have a reverse effect on your economy. And you can see the 10 largest players who are having good amounts of exports to Russia. It includes Germany, South Korea, Poland, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Turkey, US, and France. Now, I've omitted the CIS players like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and because they would not be very relevant. But all these countries, because of the sanctions.
Yogesh, just tell us what is the size of the Russian economy? GDP is how many $billion?
Yeah, GDP is $1.7 trillion.
1.7 trillion.
Yes.
So it's a relatively small economy, smaller than India.
Yes, it is half of the Indian economy. India is almost double the size of Russian economy. Similarly, with respect to the imports or the Russian exports, if you see, the major export is the mineral fuels. And if Russia tomorrow decides that they will not, because they are sanctioned and they are unable to send the mineral fuels to neighboring countries like Germany, Netherlands, etc., then they are also going to be in serious trouble. That is also one of the cases. Or if they demand that if we cannot do business in euro, then you will have to do business with us in a yuan, then that will favor China. If you see India, because we are talking about what is going to be the impact on India. So if you see the top 22 trading partners of India, so Russia does not feature in that because we have a trade of about $10 billion with Russia. Out of these 10 billion, 8 billion is what comes from Russia, and we only send about 2 billion worth of goods because our goods are mainly pharmaceuticals, tea, coffee, and things like that. Whereas the Russian goods coming to us are like aircrafts, tanks, and all military equipment. So from that point of view, there would not be a direct impact. But yes, in the defense sector, we will have an impact because 60% of our dependence is on Russia, and that is precisely the reason why we are walking a very tight rope with respect to the position that we have held in the United Nations. In terms of oil and gas, we had signed a big contract to source the Russian crude oil, but now that is going to be under question mark. Then we also in steel and other metals also have signed for the coking coal, which is one of the precursors for our steel industry. So all these contracts will definitely come under a scanner unless, of course, we get certain privileges to go ahead with our trade with Russia.
Let me ask you, Yogesh, that are there opportunities in this crisis also from an economic point of view? For example, BP, British Petroleum, is selling its assets in Russia. Should India be buying those assets, or will we get into trouble and not be able to, make money out of those assets? What's your response?
So right now, even the government of India has not given a very clear directive of what should be our stand, because we are still on the fence from the point of view.
What is your advice to the government of India? PIC will take.
My advice would be definitely this is an opportunity for us.
So
now we will have to.
Assets?
Sorry?
Should India buy the assets of BP? BP is selling its assets in Russia. Should we wait for the Chinese to buy them, or should we buy them first?
No, since we have created an energy conglomerate in Russia, where all these government petroleum companies have formed a group, I think as we can take this chance of buying the assets in Russia.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry, Yogesh, I have to cut you short because I must move now. We've got 15 minutes left. I must move now to some of the very interesting questions which are in the chat box.
Sure.
And I want to ask, there's one very interesting question, Ambassador Devre, which talks about, the impact on India and what India should be doing. And that question is India doing the right thing by staying neutral on this issue? What could be the pros and cons of this stand? So let me ask that to Ambassador Devre and also to General Patankar, Air Marshal Gokhale.
I think India didn't have much choice. This stand which we have taken is a balanced one. We have, of course, concern of this kind of warfare going on and its impact on India. At the same time, we are aware that there is a long background to what actually happened between Russia and Ukraine or Russia and the West. And in fact, our stand we have been making very clear when we abstain in the explanation of vote. We have been saying that the legitimate security interests of all players, all countries should be taken into account. I mean, that clearly mentions that security of both Ukraine as well as Russia, because as was brought out earlier, the expansion of NATO to the east, inclusion of NATO's from 16 to 30 in the span of say 15 years time, all that is, I think, implicit in what we said. We have also mentioned in this our explanation that territorial integrity and sovereignty of countries should be respected or should be maintained. I think that suggests that this kind of attack by Russia on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is something questionable. We do not accept it. So I think our position was balanced, but I think whatever we wanted to convey was conveyed, I think, in a very forceful way. And we have been consistently abstaining on this. It has also enabled us to get our students safely from Ukraine, because we have been approaching, Prime Minister has been speaking to both President Putin as well as to President Zelensky. I think that was immensely helpful that we could do that. And since we have built relations with both, with Russia, we have the relationship which goes back decades. And with Ukraine also over the last 30 years, we have developed close relationship in number of areas, including defense and trade and so on. So we want to preserve that. And we were quite convinced ourselves that by taking position on one side, I think the path which we have been advocating, path of diplomatic solution to this whole issue, cannot be really furthered. So I think our stand in that respect, I think in my view, was fairly good and balanced and a positive one.
And of course, what you're implying is that India has taken this stand or this position based on our own national interests.
Interest, obviously.
Things, obviously.
Exactly, obviously.
There's another very interesting question, and maybe I'll ask General Patankar that question. Sharad Tiwari is asking, does this stand that India has taken on the Ukraine issue or the Russia-Ukraine issue, will it affect India's aspirations of becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council?
I wish there was a cut and dry answer to this kind of a thing, because the question of a permanent being a permanent member of the Security Council is not hinging on this one single policy decision of our country. This is work in progress, and in various fora, the government has been, developing a case in our support. So I think that work will carry on. What kind of position we take in the current crisis, I don't feel is going to seriously affect that
Okay.
work.
Okay. There's another very interesting question, Air Marshal Gokhale. Let me direct it to you. And this is just to get your feelings, opinions, views on this question. Dr. Aditya Bhan of Flame University asks, how much will the Americans arm twist India on this whole Russia-Ukraine crisis? And do you see CATSA sanctions being levied against India? CATSA, of course, is act in the US, and there's a threat that they will be levied against India for importing the S-400 system from Russia.
Let me mention that there is a lot of dialogue going on within the US itself in Senate that they should not apply CATSA, because we are buying a lot of equipment, defense equipment, including the aircraft that we use in Operation Ganga, C-17. They're all from USA, and I think USA's military industrial complex would like such a huge market to continue in India. There are also other issues which are connected. So I don't think like they've turned a little blind eye for Iran relations with us. They would do that with Russia for S-400, which is the advanced stage. And let me just give you an example. Day before yesterday, from Belarusia, at 150 kilometers, they shot down a Ukrainian Sukhoi 27, in which they lost one of their most important display pilot. So that 150 kilometers.
Who lost, sir? Who lost?
Ukrainian pilot. His name is Colonel Shekechko. It's a tongue twister, but Oyashenko. So
he decorated Ukrainian pilot.
Decorated, he was one of those display pilots, and he's been shot down. So I think it's a very potent system, and I think we are looking at it from our advantage. There are also other issues. Air power, the way we have exploited the Russian equipment is very good. And the very fact they're effective or not effective in Ukraine shows why is Ukraine asking for no-fly zone? The very fact they're asking for no-fly zone, they're worried about the Russians using their full air power. They're not using it as yet. They're using
why haven't they used their full air power?
They are not wanting to expose themselves to some of these weapons which are, being given by, and the real-time intelligence which is there. So let the cruise missiles and other ones do it. They don't have that many precision-guided munitions. So they don't want to have collateral damage and having as it is information warfare against them. So I think, but as regards, other collaboration, we are sending our manned space flight, which is going to go up from USSR. There is going to be a nuclear submarine coming in another 2-3 years, again, as one of the follow-ups. And there are so many other issues, including nuclear fuel that we get for all the, so I don't think that we can cut off our relations with, so our I mean, they're both from diplomacy. I think we'll have to really have a tight rope walking on some of the diplomatic issues.
Yeah, Ambassador Devre, let me say to you and ask you, the question which was asked about India's position on this whole subject, a lot of it, a lot of ordinary Indians are thinking because of seeing everything that is being said by the West, all this, that India's position is not a good position, that it's not a tenable position in the long run, etc. So what would you like to say to those people?
I think one of the concerns what our people, as you were mentioning, ordinary people would think is a large, powerful country like Russia invading, having special forces operation, what you may call it, against a smaller, weaker neighbor in military, a military area, for whatever reasons. Each country can quote its own security reason, security interest, and then get away with this kind of operation, I think can create a precedent. It creates an example before the world that should similar large countries in the world can take action against small neighbors. It's a very potent question in the future. Similar things have happened. I'm not saying there is a whataboutery, plenty of that. Americans have done it. Other countries have also done it. But this is an example now which is before us. Are we going to allow this kind of situation to perpetuate? I think that is the worry or the concern at the back of mind of most people. Media narrative, Western media, all that is there. Unfortunately, that is the media which will be more prevalent, and impressions of the people will be generated by that. But in this situation, this is one of the main questions. And therefore, the stand which we had to take, the tight rope walking we had to do, gets relevance. My second observation, which we didn't touch at all during this discussion, is about China.
Yes.
You see, China has taken a very nuanced position. In the first resolution, or that was the procedural resolution in the UN, in Security Council, China had voted with Russia. Subsequently, if I remember, that was the first one. Subsequently, China has been abstaining. Now, China's abstention, while China has abstained, it has been maintaining that they pledge full solidarity to Russia and they are very close to Russia and so on. Now, with the introductions of sanctions against Russia, even though Russians, I think, will be able to manage them because they're used to that kind of sanctions. They had sanctions after Crimea also, and they have been taking some certain precautions. Even the crude price price of the crude, they say at $43 per barrel, Russia can break even its budget. And the price of crude today is more than $100 a barrel. So I don't know. So this is a question which we'll see. Of course, it is going to affect economies around the world. But my point about the Chinese stand and the Russian position, Russia is inevitably going to go closer to China in the coming months and years. If that happens, what will be the Russian attitude to India in terms of the threats which we have again from China? Will the Chinese try to put pressure on Russia to reinforce their viewpoint with respect to, say, Ladakh or other incursions in India? So I think we will have to think about this also. The visit of Imran Khan to Russia when this crisis was already going on, we don't know what it was for. It is, of course, said that it was already a scheduled visit.
True.
But a scheduled visit at that time can be also cancelled or can be postponed. It didn't happen. So we'll have to take I would say, a holistic view of this whole thing. And it will have to be a very dispassionate view as to what kind of relationship we are going to have. Because the whole world order is also in for a change, I think.
Sure.
This is a kind of a turning point in some ways. And
Sure.
India will have to play its cards very, very carefully.
Thank you, Ambassador Devre, for bringing up the China angle. Also, let me say that I have got an indication from Abhay and others at the PIC headquarters in Pune that we can extend our discussion by a few minutes, and therefore there's less time pressure. And I'm going to, ask you more questions which are coming up in the chat box. Very interesting questions. But on that China factor, General Patankar, one of the questions is, what the Russians have done in Ukraine, will it encourage the Chinese to march into Taiwan?
You see, the good part about the Chinese behavior is, and you would know better than anybody else in this in today's discussion, that they don't do anything as a knee-jerk kind of a thing, simply because an opportunity has presented itself. If they wanted to do this, either they would have said, okay, in future, if this happens between Russia and Ukraine, that might be an opportunity for us to do this to Taiwan. But that, to my mind, seems a little remote. The Chinese think well ahead of, for their own moves. And I don't think this is something that they're going to use. Why even Taiwan? You can apply that to ourselves and say, okay, will they, increase the heat against us, let's say in Arunachal Pradesh or in the central sector or in Ladakh, simply because things are in a flux at the moment. My own feeling is they would not, unless this has been thought through, because they may start something, and if they are not able to finish it, it'll be egg on their face.
Sure. And Air Marshal Gokhale, there's another very, very interesting question. I must thank the audience. Please keep the questions flowing. Very interesting questions. I'm going to put them to all the panelists. Yogesh, I'm coming up to you next also. But first, to Air Marshal Gokhale, taking this thing about China forward, that isn't what Russia did in Ukraine a perfect recipe for, and I'm just reading out the question now, so it's not my words, but for rogue nations like Pakistan and China. And then he focuses Vikas Apte focuses on Pakistan, saying, how do you see Pakistan raking up the issue of Jammu and Kashmir, etc., etc., etc.? So how would you react to that? How do you react to that, Air Marshal Gokhale?
There is no doubt that we'll have to be careful. As it is, we are careful of both of them joining together. But then, in the changing world order, as Ambassador Devre said, I don't think it's going to be so simple. Even General Patankar very rightly put it, that the Chinese will I read Thomas Friedman's article yesterday in the New York Times. He's urging China to play the big brother at this time and do sanctions against Russia. He said you will come out the winner in the world. But what about Indo-Pacific? What about the other issues which are affecting the whole world? So I think there would be a kind of a resistance that Chinese would meet. Pakistan per se is, I don't think we are really as much worried about their threat. I think, but coalition, that is where we work about. As far as I think I saw one of the questions in the chat boxes, we'll have to expedite our Atmanirbhar. We can't just depend on the kind of this thing. It is not easier said than done, but I think that is impetus that we'll have to give to our Atmanirbharta to try and get how. Just one additional thing is I just wanted to mention is that maybe the economic sanctions can be find way through cryptocurrency. I think that could well be another route to try and find, maybe Mr. Yogesh Joshi will throw some light on.
Yeah, maybe I'll turn to him, but I have my own reaction to Vikas Apte's question on Pakistan raising the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. I'm afraid, Vikas, that your whole way of thinking is too defensive. I would have asked the question that what Russia has done in Ukraine, does it give license for India to march into POK?
POK, correct.
That is the question we should be asking.
Yeah.
And Yogesh, how would you respond to that question?
Regarding the cryptocurrency?
No, regarding India marching into POK.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that is the first thing which comes to the mind, that if we have this opportunity available, then why not? Because anyway, this issue has been pending for a long time. United Nations in real sense has really not done much. And those who today the scene is like whoever calls the shots and is ready to take on the world, he gets his piece of the cake. So that is the norm, more or less. So if you are strong and if you can take action and then justify it, why not?
Okay. I was just being provocative, Yogesh. but please do answer the question that Air Marshal Gokhale raised on the cryptocurrency issue also.
Yeah. Actually, frankly speaking, I would not have too much information on cryptocurrency because every country today has a different stand on the cryptocurrency. So it is not a norm with which it is not a norm yet with which people are trading into. But yes, definitely one thing is for sure, that the dollar trade would go out of the routine practice, and now countries will definitely try to find out alternatives through which trading can be done. Like this yuan is definitely going to gain in this particular event. And if we are open, then maybe even the rupee ruble trade also can pick up with Russia and India.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let me return to all the participants, all the speakers, because Ambassador Devre raised this very pertinent and very important point that as a result of this Russia-Ukraine imbroglio, the whole geopolitical situation across the world is changing. And definitely one of the ways it is changing is that the limits of US power are being seen. There is going to be a more multipolar world. We've already headed in that direction, but there is a more multipolar world with Russia and China emerging as two countries which are very close. How should India navigate this coming world order? Ambassador Devre, first to you, then General Patankar, Air Marshal Gokhale, and then Yogesh.
See, we are living an interdependent world today. The world is marked by globalization. Today, supply chains determine economies of most of us. Now, these events, what have happened in Ukraine and the impact of these sanctions and all that, can put a sort of stop or can come in the way of the current trends or whatever we are now used to for the last 30, 40 years, globalization and the consequent changes which have taken place in the world. So India has benefited a lot through globalization. We cannot afford to let that go. We cannot let supply chains to affect us. Our whole semiconductor business today is dependent on that. Similar, many things. So we'll have to really see that all these sanctions, the violence or the conflicts, somehow we keep ourselves away from them. And that will be the test for Indian diplomacy now. We will have to keep this paramount national interest in mind, that we do not let ourselves be affected by these happenings in the world, because they are happening because of the interests of those particular countries. Our own interest has to be protected. And I think here I would therefore hope that South Bloc will study these developments very closely, which has implications for the policy of India for years to come.
General Patankar, your thoughts on the coming global order, the importance of the Indo-Pacific? Is that salience of Indo-Pacific going to decline in American eyes at least?
Yes, in fact, I entirely agree with what Ambassador Devre has outlined. And I'm no expert on foreign policy, but it seems to me that maintaining our national interests as the center stage, we should balance our reactions. And another thing I might like to add to this is that we should strive to maintain our attractiveness to the rest of the world. For instance, what we are good at, what we represent by way of a very large market for various things, including arms import and so on, for at least the foreseeable future. Investment destination. After all, with this great thrust on Make in India, there is that attractiveness which is nascent, which can be developed further. So I think we would do well to maintain our national interest as the core of all our actions, and do things like maintain our attractiveness to the rest of the world for whatever. IT, that's our strength. People may want to deal with us simply because they need us. So in areas where we are able to attract the attention and the interest of other countries, that's where we should put all our effort and maintain. This situation, the dust will take a few years to settle down before this multipolar or bipolar order emerges. So this is the right thing would be, as soon as in a sandstorm, cover your mouth and face and wait for the dust to settle down before you're standing up again and doing your own thing. Thank you.
So, Marshal Gokhale, Ambassador Devre is saying that we should steer clear of getting pulled into these kind of situations, the current situation between Russia and Ukraine as example. And General Patankar is saying if we are able to do that successfully, we will actually be able to focus on our own economics and economic development and progress. Your views on the emerging global order, please.
I totally endorse both the views. That is, our need of the hour at the moment is the poverty alleviation, economy. And I think there are a couple of blocks that we have recently joined. There is BRICS, in which only Brazil is absent. Otherwise, all the others have been, have abstained from the anti-Russia. That is South Africa, India, China, and of course Russia. Similarly, there are two of these pods that are emerging. One pod, of course, USA, Australia, but there is another pod which is in the Middle East. Again, the Middle East has got reservations about what the US policies are. So I think maybe we can look at some of these, emerging blocks, markets, strengthen them, use to our economic advantage. And by the time we pull our economy up, meanwhile, do all these things like Atmanirbhar, which is very important because you need to have soft power and hard power as together to be able to come to a certain amount of standing in the world.
Very interesting. Yogesh, your thoughts, your views, your comments?
Yeah. In fact, since I represent the pharmaceutical industry, this is our strong area. And thanks to our indigenous strength, we could, tide over this COVID issue with our own vaccine, both developed in India as well as the one which we got from Oxford. So we had 2 vaccines when many people had none during the entire period. So like pharma industry, there are many other industries where we continue to work with, even in this case, we are working with Ukraine as well as with Russia. So we by and large have a trend across the world that we are actually having good relations with people who between themselves don't have good relations. So that I think is our strength, and that strength we can continue to exploit, and yet without compromising on our internal interests, what we want to do for our own country. I think we can continue with the same, because ultimately, since I am from the business side, I have seen that Indian entrepreneurs, or even for that matter, executives, wherever they are placed, they will find out a way of how things can be done rather than getting into ego issues. And if that is done, then it is nothing but what diplomacy is. That is the same thing which is happening even in business. I think the same trend will help us to make us much more stronger. And with that, then we will be able to, be the main mediators in these kind of issues and try to, calm down most of the issues with our expertise in that area.
Okay, I think we have just a few more minutes left. So let me ask each of the participants, each of the speakers to give some closing thoughts, closing remarks, if you like. Let me start with Ambassador Devre, but Ambassador Devre, let me also say that there's a very interesting question in the Q&A box or in the chat box, which says that everyone talks about Russia's security needs. What about Ukraine's security needs? So if you could also answer that question in your closing remarks, please.
Yes, Ukraine as an independent country and a democracy at that, because, unlike very few countries in that region, Ukraine was able to develop itself as a democracy. It has also progressed very rapidly in terms of education, industry, business, and so on. So I think the country was looking forward to its association with European Union. I don't know if that goes through, because this is already now requested by President Zelensky. And if they work out this kind of arrangement that they get the membership of EU and they renounce the membership of NATO, and therefore thereby work out a kind of a modus vivendi with Russia, I think that country can then eventually find peace. But now for Russia to have a neighbor, and if it is under their influence in the coming years, which has completely been devastated, to build the economy and normalcy in Ukraine is going to be a major challenge. And I think in that, perhaps I think that will be Ukraine's main security interest. How to build that country again. They will require help from many other countries, and there they might have to keep politics apart. So we have, I think, as was mentioned earlier, excellent relations with countries in Europe. We are in the process of building them further. Our security interests, I think, lie in this region, and therefore we will have to be very sensitive to the security interests of smaller neighbors, just as we have been talking about the security of Russia, and accordingly tailoring our response to this.
General
Yeah. Bangwali, just 2 questions which you may want to look at. One is from Mr. Srinivas. How popular is Putin in Russia?
Let me ask that to Yogesh. Yogesh, how popular is Putin in Russia? He gets re-elected every time.
No, he gets re-elected and all that is, I think I will not comment on that. But definitely the people look up to him, because to a great extent, they also do not have an alternative of who next, at the moment at least. So unless there is somebody who has been, or it has been, tailored in such a way that nobody threatens his position, that could be a possibility. But at the moment, at least, it looks like that people are with him.
No, I think what the questioner is asking, Yogesh, is that after having started this war with Ukraine, has Putin's popularity come down within Russia, or has it not been impacted? What is your take on it?
In some during my discussions, some of the people, of course, nobody is happy with the war. That is across the Russia. So they are not enjoying that. Oh, now we are going to go and teach them a lesson. That kind of a mood does not exist. But at the same time, people are at a loss of an idea of how this will end and how soon it will end. So they are neither against him, but they are basically of the opinion that somebody somewhere should do something so that this first stops. And then we can talk and find a long-term arrangement of how to exist.
What's the second question, Abhay?
This is from Mr. Vilas Rajwade. Can a situation be created where EU, Russia, and China will need India more than before? Is there a role for India to play here?
Play in what?
In the crisis, in resolving the crisis, or in?
Let's ask General Patankar then.
Well, I think the very topic for this discussion was where is it heading and how does it affect us? And where do we go from here? That was the unsaid part of the title. So let me use this question to say how well we seem to be safeguarding our interest and navigating our way through this imbroglio. And I think our political leadership and our diplomats have done a splendid job of that thus far, and I have no reason to believe that it's going to be any different in the foreseeable future. If you cast your mind back to 1971, when we had a huge problem of refugee influx on the one hand, and the clear possibility of a war, coming right out at our doorstep. There was a diplomatic offensive that was taken up under the political leadership of Mrs. Gandhi then, and that proved to be very decisive or very, very useful, I would say, in the aftermath of that war, when it started and so on and so forth. Now, today, we are probably not in a parallel situation, but a difficult situation nevertheless. And I think, like I said, the leadership and diplomacy is doing a splendid job. I think we should carry on doing that, safeguard our interests, and I'm sure we will come out from it pretty much unsinged and unscathed.
Mr. Rajwade, I also have a little, reflection on your question. I think what we need to do is what Ambassador Devre, General Patankar, and the others also, Air Marshal Gokhale and Yogesh Joshi, have been saying that we need to focus domestically on our own selves, build up our economic strength, build up our economy, and only through building up our economy, make it a 5 trillion, 7 trillion, 8 trillion, whatever is the target and whatever we want to have in the future. That is a way to make yourself indispensable to a multipolar world. So I think we need to use this breathing space that we have got for ourselves to build up our own economy, and we need to do it as fast as possible. Air Marshal Gokhale?
I totally agree with you. And I think, one of the reasons why Turkey has been chosen, I think I read a little more to it because Chinese had offered. Even India, there was no open indication, but there was this talk that maybe Prime Minister Modi is speaking to both the sides and possibly trying to mediate. I think Turkey has been chosen by Russia very smartly. They've been having a lot of history, of course, of wars. But since the Turkish drones are being used by the Ukrainian, I think they wanted to give them a clear warning. And I think today Turkey made a statement that these are not given as a NATO kind of equipment, but these are bought. These were purchased by Ukraine, trying to say that, look, they are free to sell it to anybody. And I think Ukraine also, to an extent, trusts Turkey to do mediation, being a NATO country. So I think, us doing mediation would be very good if we can, but whether the world will accept it and whether both sides will accept it to that extent, I really don't think so.
I think we have gone 15 minutes ahead of, over the time that we had originally planned. It shows how topical this subject is. It is still evolving, as all the panelists and all the speakers have said. So what I would like to urge PIC is maybe in 4 to 6 weeks from now, perhaps we should revisit this issue because it's of topical interest. There's been huge interest across our membership and beyond. So perhaps we can revisit this issue and have this conversation 4 to 6 weeks down the line. So with that, Abhay, I hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bambawale, for chairing this session and for moderating it so wonderfully, bringing in so many questions and giving so many perspectives and insights into this crisis. We began with Ambassador Devre, who gave us a fantastic overview and provided clarity on the situation in Ukraine. He took us through the history of Ukraine and how Ukraine has always been pro-West, and the issue of NATO membership was discussed in detail. General Patankar told us about the possible political objectives of Russia and how the encircling of Ukraine was happening by Russian forces. We had wonderful insights from Mr. Yogesh Joshi, who has been working out of the Moscow office of Serum Institute of India, and Air Marshal Bhushan Gokhale. And overall, this was a very insightful discussion. And I would like to mention that this will be available on YouTube for circulation and sharing and for your reference. Before closing, I would like to give some information on PIC's next event. This is a talk on India's new growth model by Dr. Aizaz Ghani, lead economist, World Bank. This is on 15th March at 6 p.m. And the discussants will be Professor Gurudas Nulkar, Trustee, Ecological Society, and Dr. Niranjan Raj Adyaksha, CEO and Senior Fellow, Artha India Research Advisory. With this, I would like to thank all our panelists and all the members of the audience for participating in this event. Thank you very much, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.